Your life is finite. Should you have the good fortune to live to see 83, then a single month is the equivalent to 0.1% of your life. Or to further analogize it, if your 83-year-old existence was translated into a piggy bank in which life ends at the $100 mark, then for every 3 days that pass, you would contribute a single cent to your own demise. An uncomfortable thought, perhaps, but acknowledging how you spend your days is how you spend your life reminds us to make the most of the limited time that we've been allotted. You're in the game of life, play as a winner. What is the high life for you? Prestige, power, wealth, admiration? The roaring crowds who shout out hard-earned money to see you perform? To live lavishly, a life of opulence and hedonism, the privilege to experience true luxury? To be a globetrotter, your name international, and a bed always waiting for you wherever you find yourself? To dwell within the halls of power, your own seat at the table with the elites, whether in conference rooms or ballrooms? To exercise outstanding influence and do any and all as you please and desire? Might you aspire to see such heights?
Well, so does most everyone else, one way or another. In our relatively comfortable lives of the third millennium, it's easy to forget that at the end of the day, it is and always has been a dog-eat-dog world. Should you exit the confines of civil society, you'll be forced to learn your place, whether it be braving the wilderness or stepping up to play in the arenas of the big leagues.
In the big leagues, the innocent ideals of the social contract are only binding for the common person. Here, you're just another dog, and the only way to get what you demand is to eat those in your way. Not vicious enough, and it'll be you who's devoured. Tony Montana understood this. In the 1983 film Scarface, Al Pacino plays a political refugee who arrives in Miami after fleeing Fidel Castro's Cuba. Montana begins his pursuit for high living with his hands bloody, he and his friend Manny Rivera killing a former henchman at the Castro regime in exchange for green cards arranged by local drug lord Frank Lopez. With their American residency secured, Montana embarks on his ascent to the top, using the backs of those who might get in the way as rungs on a ladder. But the higher Tony Montana climbed, the greater the stakes and the nastier the business. Montana eventually gets everything he wants, the power, the money, the girl, but in spite of so, Tony is wretchedly miserable, constantly paranoid of past foes exacting retribution and unknown egos out to take for themselves what he has, afraid of a knife in the back from those close to him just as how he betrayed those who trusted him, his subconscious mind plagued with debilitating horrors and his existence reduced to a living dead. In the end, despite all that was said and done, Tony is consumed by a larger dog, death and escape from the supposed high life he led.
But of course, Tony Montana is a fictional character. His story just another clean-laid narrative of what it means to live large through any means necessary. In reality, life is far more filthy, far more high and low, and after all is said and done, it's your life that's on the shelf.
To be a high roller requires being dealt at least a decent hand to begin with. For many, the only way to rise above the crop is to play under the table. But frankly, the lower you're born on the social ladder, the greater the means necessary for class ascension. And whom better an example of high living in the soft, corrupted underbelly of society than the main source of inspiration for Tony Montana, Al Capone? Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born in Brooklyn at the turn of the century, 1899, child to Italian immigrants. Even at a young age, Capone had his sights set high, joining the Five Points gang of Lower Manhattan as a teenager, from which he would serve as muscle in whatever organized operations might demand such a presence, from brothels to intersyndicated commerce. It's during this time he would be marked with his famous scars, after a local regular of one of the bars, Frank Lucio, slashed his face up after perceiving disrespect from Capone towards his sister. From the dusk of the 19th century to the dawn of the 20th century, there was a humble city in the American Midwest which was experiencing massive growth and development. I'm of course referring to Chicago, and its exploding relevance attracted ambitious minds seeking to carve out their own empire from the freshly cast eye of the city. Among these existentially ravenous individuals was, of course, Vincenzo Big Jim Colosimo, the man responsible for wrangling together the squabbling petty gangs of South Chicago under one umbrella, soon to be known as the Chicago Outfit. Unfortunately for Big Jim, when you're in the Thunderdome, the only person you can trust is yourself. In fact, Colosimo grew to neglect as age and love softened him. And it's for so that his right-hand man, who he picked off the streets of Lower Manhattan, Johnny the Fox Torrio, had him killed over disagreements on how the gang should operate in the new paradigm of the Prohibition. A job ultimately well done on May 11th of 1920, when Big Jim was shot in the back of his head at close range in his restaurant at Colosimo's Cafe by hired hitman Frankie Yale. No one was ever charged for the murder. And with so, the Fox took over as boss of the Chicago outfit, with young Al Capone, whom had also been recruited by Colosimo some years earlier and looked up to Johnny as a mentor of sorts, now lieutenant. The early 1920s marched on under the shadow of Prohibition as the gangs of Chicago ramped up their illicit operation, reaping unprecedented windfalls of cash at the cost of interorganizational stability. Such escalating friction turning hot in 1925, when hits from rivals were ordered on Torrio and Capone. Capone would survive his ambush untouched, but the same couldn't be said for Torrio. When following Al's attempted murder, Johnny would be shot several times outside his home with his wife, barely surviving the ordeal. Traumatized and done with such risky business, the fox would ultimately move back to his country of birth, Italy, with his mother and wife, handing the reins of the outfit to Capone, which by this point was grossing well over $1.25 billion a year in today's money. And so, at the age of 26, Al Capone was now a proper mob boss, overseeing the most influential crime syndicate of the Midwest. Rather than maintaining a low profile as his predecessors preferred, Capone preferred to indulge in life's finest. Custom suits and jewelry, imported cigars and exotic food, beautiful women, public philanthropy, property collecting, buying officials, and all else that satisfied Scarface's hedonistic ways. Too bad such a high life is predicated on such foul instability. As Capone's notoriety grew, so too the efforts to cut him down. It didn't help that sustaining such a reign required extreme measures, and while the history of Capone's Chicago outfit is greatly vast, the inflection point of Capone's life would come February 14th of 1929. You see, regardless of however heightened hostilities between intercity gangs may be, cooperation is mandatory for everyone's bottom line, an untrusted, delicate relationship solely dependent on what is most lucrative to all those involved. Capone's bootlegging operation was that of logistics. The Chicago outfit would receive liquor shipments from a slew of production hubs, from which they would distribute to their speakeasies and sell to competitors. After a couple of bad business moves by bitter rival George Bugs Moran of the Northside Gang in search of more profit, the liquor trade deal between him and Capone was snuffed, and despite Moran's efforts to renege the original agreement, Capone flatly refused to re-engage in business. Taking matters into his own hands, Moran's Northside Gang began a campaign of hijacking incoming shipments from the Purple Gang to satisfy their thirsty patrons, measures wholly unacceptable to Capone, who, upon hearing the news, began plotting his response. First, by renting an apartment across the street from 2122 North Clark Street, a warehouse which served as the Northside Gang's main base of operation. On February 13th, Moran would receive an offer for a freshly hijacked Purple Gang shipment, to which he ordered its delivery to their Clark Street headquarters. Despite disagreements from confidants of Bugs who sniffed something awry, the deal was set in motion, and the next day, on Valentine's Day, 7 of George's men would congregate at the warehouse, waiting for Moran's arrival as well as the eventual delivery. Rather, Bugs elected to take his sweet time, and while the details are very much unclear, our best understanding is that sometime around 10:30, a black Escalade rolled up to the warehouse, from which 4 would enter the building, 2 wearing police uniforms and the other 2 dressed as plain civilians. Soon after, George finally shows up, though he sees the vehicle and presumes it to be police, opting to drive past in favor of a cup of coffee. Meanwhile, George's 7 men inside the warehouse are being lined up against a wall, from which they were executed in excess with Thompson submachine guns and sawed-off shotguns. Following such grisly business, the 2 policemen escorted the 2 civilian-dressed men to get the appearance of the ne'er-do-well's arrest. Neighbors, of course, quickly called police, and upon the scene's discovery, the massacre made national headlines. From here, Capone's life devolved into a fruitless game of desperately gripping the high he once had. Public sentiment turned, and the heat from pursuing law enforcement began to boil over. Much can be told of Capone's life before and after the mass slaughter, but regardless of however his saga unfolded, the final act came about on the 17th of October 1931, when Capone was convicted for the final time, at the age of 32, for none other than tax evasion. After a series of prison transfers due to tensions with inmates, including being stabbed and non-fatally, it would all soon be of little importance to Al, as by the late 1930s, his formerly extravagant lifestyle had caught up to him when syphilis he contracted as an early 20-something-year-old spread to his brain, ravaging his mental faculties. It's for so he'd ultimately be granted parole on November 16th of 1939, as his cognitive capacity was that of a preteen according to his physicians. Despite being among the first with access to a novel drug on the market, penicillin, the disease was far too advanced, and Capone spent his last 6 years in his Palm Island mansion surrounded by family, too far gone to understand the context of which he lived, and ultimately dying on January 25th of 1947 after a series of cascading organ failure at just 48 years old. While originally buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery in Chicago, the remains of Capone, his father, and his brother were ultimately moved to Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, where they rest today. Capone may have lived gloriously, but however high the view Capone may have seen, it was for a lifetime of strife and anxiety. A permanent target etched into your back by plotting enemies and leering authorities, and a lifestyle sustained by the blood of foes and the vices of folk. Scarface is just another example of what it means to be of the top dogs in this arena, sharing ranks with those such as Pablo Escobar, who was slain at 44, and El Chapo, who's living out the rest of his years wilting away in America's most secure supermax prison. It's no wonder that, especially in the underworld, the brightest stars burn the fastest. A life of true luxury, sure, but there are no happy endings to be found here.
Perhaps then, one may posit that the heights of celebrities is the place to be. A life where you don't have to buy goodwill, as Capone did with the soup kitchens and generous community contributions, but one where people give you their hard-earned cash with a smile. To not sleep with one eye open at night for the happening, but to slumber in ostentatious comfort under a multi-million-dollar roof. To live basked in the limelight.
Well, be warned, celebritydom too is a Faustian bargain. a life of real prestige and ability in exchange for privacy and normalcy, both the fundamental necessities of the human condition. I could endeavor to give a narrative as I did with Capone's story, but frankly, I think we're all more than well aware of the cognitively caustic nature of the life of stars. For the longest time, humans are relegated to eat, shit, sleep, survive, produce, and reproduce. Not only is it natural for some brains and nervous systems to implode under the stinging pressure of the high life, it's inevitable. From the abuse of the industry, labels and production houses owning the souls of those who signed exploitative contracts, to the everlasting gaze fixed on you from the public, adoring fans with high expectations and jeering naysayers with plenty of criticism alike, to living up to the expectations of the culture, never allowing yourself to age gracefully or be comfortable just being, to the deprivation of a normal life, the capacity to live without bother, and the means to be personal and love without prying eyes, to the unbridled access to drugs of any effect and caliber, to the yes men who masquerade as friends, supporting and encouraging your worst impulses, taking advantage of your status and wealth for their own gain, and all else outside and in between. It's no wonder contemporary history is littered with examples of the high life-breaking celebrities, all in their own way, for their own reasons. Furthermore, even amongst those who may not present public-facing faults, stories persist of the toxicity of such a lifestyle to a person's being. The perception of themselves in reality, the rampant domestic abuse and divorce rates, the struggle with substance abuse and sustaining a career peak. Many sex symbols and A-listers are utterly filthy, believing themselves to be above bathing and brushing their teeth. The spite and contempt from stars towards regular people and those who service them, who they feel are beneath them. The hyper-reinforced egos of the famous, which blind them from accepting fault and absolves them of morality.
But after all, why would they need to be clean, be kind, and keep a good head on their shoulders? They're celebrities.
Of course, there are tiers to stardom, and certainly there are celebrities who've escaped the scourge that comes with such a life, but they're the minority, and even within that minority, problems with alcoholism and drug addiction, body and facial dysmorphia, and stunted social development persist. Though I suppose that applies to everyone, regardless of class. The question is, to what extent can you handle your suffering under scrutiny? Now, don't take my commentary on those involved here as disparaging. Everyone is a product of their circumstances, and given the inter-celebrity and industry culture, not to mention the ontologically observant eyes of the public, how could they not have turned out the way they did? Everyone has problems, to be sure, and celebrities definitely live lavish, high lives. It's just that they carry a different kind of burden for so. I guess you can ask yourself, is the financial freedom and notoriety worth living in the existential pressure cooker? Famous gasoline, and if you're not careful, you might just self-immolate. Rather than the stage, some prefer a more private venue of life, to substitute the public recognition for even greater swaths of cash, oodles of wealth, to be of the ones who grip the leashes of celebrities and checkbooks of politicians, day drinking and gumming coke up in high-rise boardrooms and top-floor office spaces, a realm so high it's seldom seen by the public, a league where you can boot up a Bloomberg terminal to collude with development point Owaba centers against the poor whose only function is to be your exit liquidity. A plane from where governments bend over backwards to ensure that each nest your vast stretching fingers fondle remain bountiful and profitable. A lifestyle in which all else of your life is emotionally dwarfed by the depression and euphoria of your portfolio swings, where the quality of your day is determined by the number on your screen relative to yesterday's. If you desire to play at the high rollers table, then you have to be willing to trample and even kill for a seat, even if it means your own friends, parents, or siblings. And should you secure your chair, the buy-in is what little remains left of your humanity.
深刻世界の体制と帝国の現状とに鑑み、以上の措置をもって議局を収集せんと欲し。
On August 15th of 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced to his people their nation's surrender following the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 2.5 weeks later, on September 2nd, high-ranking representatives of a defeated Japan would sign the Japanese instrument of surrender aboard the USS Missouri, and with so, the time to conduct all post-war business had arrived. And so as the sun finally set, humanity found themselves on a whole new world of geopolitical paradigms, one of which being that of Japan's former colony, the peninsula of Korea, which had been under the imperial boot for 35 years. With the USA and USSR the two undisputed world powers, Korea was split in the middle at the 38th parallel, the two regions under direct influence of their respective superpowers. And though the original plan had been unification, irreconcilable political differences proved too great, and the two zones evolved to be their own independent nations. Both leaders, from their capitals in Pyongyang and Seoul, claimed sovereignty over the entirety of Korea, declaring the other to be illegitimate. Such tensions coming to a head in 1950, when on June 25th, the Korean People's Army, or as we know them, North Korea, invaded the South with the support of the Soviet Union. Seoul was captured in just 3 days, and the newly formed United Nations were furious with such a brazen attack. In response, the organization would launch their own defensive campaign, with boots hitting the ground on September 15th, from which the UN forces would reclaim Seoul in just 3 days as well. And from there, the Korean War would rage on for several years. In the midst of all this, wealthy and well-connected businessman Lee Byung-chul found himself in Busan, having fled Seoul as many others were forced to following the KPA's offensive. Here, he opened a sugar refinery, which would serve as his primary business until came the end of the war on July 27, 1953. With the cessation of direct conflict, the standings of the two Koreas ossified, and America too emerged even more dominant and its global geopolitical grip even tighter. Korea as a whole devastated, America took South Korea under its wing as it did with Japan and much of Europe, signing a mutual security agreement which involved the Yankees pumping billions into South Korea's reconstruction. In order to best expedite their recovery with Uncle Sam's wealth, the South Korean government delegated the economic and industrial reconstruction of the country to a few privileged men, of whom included Lee Byung-chul. In fact, Lee was South Korea's golden boy, the recipient of unprecedentedly generous benefits and regulatory exemptions, which allowed him to unilaterally commandeer swaths of the developing economy, starting with humble factories and accruing enough wealth and power to buy the very same banks who had uncritically lent him money. And of course, it helps that Lee was close friends with the first president of South Korea, Syngman Rhee. As South Korea emerged from desolation, so ballooned Lee's businesses through the 50s and 60s, growing at an average of 93% annually. It's with this obscenely fattening wealth that Lee was able to break into the globally developing sector of electronic technology, establishing on January 13th of 1969 what we know today as Samsung Electronics. The chaebols are the individuals and families who control the megacorporations of South Korea. Lee may have been the favorite of the early South Korean government, but he certainly wasn't the only lucky one to be entrusted to delivering South Korea its new and glorious future. Samsung is the largest of several chaebol-ran conglomerates, but in the end, there's really four heavy hitters in the arena. Of course, Samsung Group, SK Group, Hyundai Motor Group, and LG Corporation. Just these four companies make up more than 40% of South Korea's entire economy, with the top 30 business groups accounting for roughly more than 3/4. Just Samsung on its own accounts for roughly 13% of the entire economy. With the uncountable magnitudes of soul-poisoning cash just sloshing around in these companies, it's no wonder the lives within these circles are defined by permanent power struggle. Lee Byung-chul would die of cancer in 1987 at the age of 77, splitting his empire in 5 ways for 5 of his 8 children, the process of which itself inflicting great turmoil and resentment between the siblings. Most importantly, Byung-chul named his third son, Lee Kun-hee, to be a successor, entrusting him to the apple of South Korea's eyes, Samsung Electronics. What followed, again, is far too complex and storied for me to do justice, but all of relevance can be condensed into a point I previously made. When you're playing in the echelons of the global elite with billions, if not trillions on the line, the good-natured social notions of relational and familial priority and love are to be utterly quashed. Your wealth, your capital, takes precedence over all. Kun-hee, upon being made chairman, embarked on a bitterly cold campaign of consolidating power. Among the first of many moves being the purging of even potential dissenters, regardless of how close they may have been, which included his own siblings and their children.
Those on the chopping block would be outcast from the group and cut off from any wealth entailed, then publicly humiliated so as to prevent any wise ideas from those in exile. Still not enough, Lee II would order the perpetual surveillance and intimidation of any family deemed to be adversarial, leading to several legal disputes which would be squashed by Samsung one way or another. And while his efforts in gripping onto such a fiercely desired chair would prove in large part to be successful, it was at the cost of those once close to Lee II, as the strife induced by the chairman would be responsible for the mental breaking of several family members, the consequences of which including suicide.
By his own admission, Kun-hee's soul was at least, in some part, corrupted from the role as chairman, an inevitable consequence of wielding such power and prestige. In addition to a deteriorated family, barely functional only for the sake of the business, Lee II also professed he had found himself incapable of simple universal joys, including the ability to laugh at jokes. He'd also be charged and convicted on 2 separate occasions, first in 1996 as well as 2008, mainly for corruption and bribery as a South Korean custom. In both times, he was pardoned by the sitting president, again, South Korean custom.
Lee Kun-hee, by all accounts, it seemed to have it all. Truly bottomless pockets, the uncritical backing of the government, and the means to do as he pleases, legal or not. And while so may be true, the price for such a high life was paid for by Lee's family and soul.
The Samsung family, as with all the chaebols, are mired in conflict and competition, betrayal, sabotage, corruption, harassment, suicide, and whatever else, and that's only what we know of within the families. The chaebols are also responsible for a great deal of suffering and exploitation among the Korean people as well, but when you're this high up on the totem pole, the subjugation of others is as matter-of-fact as breathing. Lee II would die in 2020 after a 6-year coma at the age of 78, his death, yet again, sparking the power struggle still in motion today. What good is infinite money if it comes at the cost of what makes us human? To be able to trust people, your own family, and to sleep at night without the weight of the context you've lived. South Korea is a good microcosm in how wealth consumes one's humanity, thanks to the comical influence exerted by the chaebols, but make no mistake, the moral of this story is far better exemplified by the even shadier and wealthier American elite. A country whose ocean of wealth and excess sloshes around the world with such force and scale, murder is just another tool to protect what relatively little trickles into the hands of the forever thirsty. A land where families like the Murdochs wrestle within for control over media empires that influence the minds of billions.
a realm with wealth generated from which the elites benefiting from take no reservation in snuffing out trouble through extrajudicial means, where the government directly encourages, abets, and covers for individuals, corporations, and countries who seek to maximize suffering for the bottom lines of those who perpetuate so. America is, of course, not the only breeding ground for moral corruption, though it certainly offers the greatest nest to nourish so. Evil manifests itself regardless of time and locale, from the burgeoning cities of the Middle East at the dawn of civilization to the centers of wealth and power today. For a rare few birds from every generation of insatiable gluttony, a truly high life is defined by boasting the prestige of superstars, the blank checkbooks of high rollers, the security of having surpassed the bounds of the law, and after all that, to feel as if your throne at the top of the world is everlasting. To transcend past the elites into the halls of history and legend, a domain from where all society is that of a snow globe to do it as you please, untethered to the rules within.
To be totalitarian. Totalitarianism presents itself in many forms. Don't be fooled. While the uber elites of any system may not exist in a totalitarian state, their hunger is most certainly so.
Arguably the best possible class to land upon in the lottery of life, the aristocrats have never lived a day of material deprivation, born into nobility without the internal degeneration that comes with power politics on the ascent. Yet, despite never having to struggle to obtain such status, they remain incapable of ceding even the tiniest morsel of their privilege for greater good, even if out of their own interest. The French aristocracy of the 18th century were very much living high. True wealth was beginning to emerge from Europe in the dawn of the First Industrial Revolution, allowing the nobility to indulge in luxury never even dreamed of before. Meanwhile, despite some moderate increases in the standard of living for the gentry and above, quality of life for those below only continued to languish. Economic disparity accelerated, and as the economy slowed and the temperature of the masses grew hotter, then came recession in 1785, followed by poor crop harvest in 87 and 88. Such socio-economic turbulence sparked an initial wave of mass fury from the people, to which Louis XVI so graciously offered some modest reforms, proposals never even followed through on due to internal opposition within the aristocracy, despite how little such measures would actually affect them. And well, you know the story. On July 14th of 1789, revolutionists would storm the Bastille, a well-stocked royal fortress, taking it within hours and executing its governor. From there, the French Revolution went full bore, and by the end of it, more than a decade later, around 14,000 to 17,000 people were killed, a figure of which about 15% comprised of the elite and uber-elite, and of course, includes King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. See, the aristocrats may live among the highest of lives, maybe even the highest depending on how you might want to define such an abstract label, but even with the inherent security of being born royalty and the comfort of a life of excess with quote-unquote clean hands, to cede even one doubloon from your dragon's hoard of gold to the scourge which constitute all society beneath you is tantamount to utter defeat. To offer even the tiniest appeasement, even if only on paper, a humiliation so terrible that risking death is preferable to reconciliation. Should you be born an aristocrat at any point in time, chances are your spirit will fester in security. But when you're so high up, the clouds obscure what's on the ground, and no matter how high you may find yourself, there's no such thing as escaping humans. A fact many have only learned after it was too late.
Really, if you want to secure your place at the ultra-high rollers table, you need to have earned it. Sure, it might mean breaking a few, or countless spines on the way up, but what does the damage matter when you're an oligarch? A realm of wealth and authority so vast you can buy the will of countries and the souls of the willing. To have a name of reputation earned, rather than some nebulous, conditional respect given to you for having been born in the right place and time. To be feared. When you've proven no business too filthy to get what you want, people are a lot less likely to have something to say, let alone stand in your way. To be an oligarch is to own the leagues dogs play in their own pursuit of wealth. To live a life looking down upon your fellow humans as the dregs in which the boots of those such as yourself walk upon.
On November 16th of 1988, Estonia became the first Soviet state to declare sovereignty, and with so, the straw broke the bear's back. The flag of the Soviet Union would be lowered for the final time that Christmas, marking the official dissolution of the bloc, and Russia was now on its own. In the few years leading up to the collapse, Russia, under Mikhail Gorbachev, was seeing increasing economic liberalization, allowing for some savvy individuals to exploit the delicate economic transition to their gain, though they were not yet wealthy or powerful enough to become full-blown oligarchs. That was soon to change, as in the December of 1991, the new Russian leader, Boris Yeltsin, began his shock therapy by removing price controls leading to complete economic collapse, which thereby allowed those who had grown rich under Gorbachev's leadership to swoop in and purchase swaths of stock in recently privatized state-run enterprises. This was still only the beginning, as in the mid-1990s, another plan was devised to enable the oligarchs' further heights. Boris Yeltsin was coming up for re-election in 1996, though the state struggled to afford the funds necessary for a re-election campaign. In a backroom deal, the government secured multi-billion-dollar loans from the proto-oligarchs with shares in still state-owned companies as collateral. When the loans were defaulted on, as planned, the lenders became permanent owners of the most valuable industries of Russia. And with such a new age, the oligarchs effectively controlled every level of Russian society, from industry to media to politics and all else within the sphere of influence for the ghost of the USSR. Now that may sound all fun and good for the oligarchs, now sitting on wealth exceeding gods and wielding globally spanning influence, but even as an oligarch, there's still always someone higher than you. It can be hard to remember that though, when you seemingly sit upon the peak of the world. The thing is, up here, the ones really in charge take no qualms in removing those who forget their place. Just since the beginning of 2022, from the lead-up of the invasion of Ukraine and onwards, there have been at least 88 highly suspicious deaths of oligarchs, or at the very least, those who held substantial power within Russia. When you're the head of a system full of ambitious, opportunistic actors, then you can't be afraid of forcefully yanking leashes in. A power philosophy Vladimir Putin more than understands. When you're an oligarch, not only is your soul doomed to unavoidable decay, but you're prone to slipping on a banana peel and falling out of a high-rise window for getting on your master's wrong side, a fundamental construct that has existed since the emergence of societal hierarchical power. Perhaps then, some might postulate the solution to achieving the prime high life is to be a true totalitarian. To be an oligarch and aristocrat is to have peers one way or another. But what if you were to transcend past accountability to be supreme above all? To live a life of power so great, entropy is your only obstacle. Here, the only thing stopping you is yourself, or should you become too drunk with power, the intervention of entire nations. Very few men, and even fewer women, have stood upon the perch of absolute power, but none have escaped the consequence from such a view. It's simply a matter of hoping the fall isn't fatal. Even from a modern perspective, history has only shown what wretched lives are produced from such heights. The totalitarians of World War II all paid a price for their ambitions. Benito Mussolini, the one who coined totalitarianism, was shot and hanged upside down alongside his mistress, Clara Petacci, by his own people. Someone who saw in himself the greatest, reduced to a pitiful puppet of Hitler at the end of his life. Adolf Hitler blew his brains out, his wife Eva Braun committing suicide in great pain with cyanide, a fitting end for one of history's great demons, whose final years marred with drug and stress-induced degeneration, and whose delusions grew to engulf reality. Joseph Stalin may have been among the victors, though he would grow mad with the years and encroaching American supremacy, his megalomania and paranoia leading to the death of millions of his own citizens and the executions of those ones close to him, his purported last days that of discontent and melancholy. Granted, Hirohito got a pretty sweet deal out of it, only having to endure universal shame from publicly renouncing his divine status and living as a bitch of America, but ultimately, that was the extent of his punishment, as his cooperation was deemed necessary for Japan's alliance. Even today, we see the high lives of totalitarians. The aforementioned Vladimir Putin, the undisputed leader of Russia and the highest of the oligarchs, had eyes too big for his mouth and was unable to bite it, his country on year 4 of a 3-day operation in Ukraine. All the means to do what he wants in the world, and Putin will spend his last years wanting more, wishing for the glory of a long-gone Soviet Union. The richest man in the world, Elon Musk, in his infinite wealth, only desires to accrue even more. Once held in high regards from the general populace as the people's billionaire, Musk has only proven himself as an insecure, immiserated, raging drug addict with a broken familial life, just about all of those he ever loved having disowned him. It's no wonder that with such a sad and empty personal life, Musk feels the need to constantly prove himself, a pathological LARPer who lies about the most menial of achievements while rewriting or burying history whenever inconvenient, which happens to be most of his life. All it takes is a little scrolling of Elon's timeline to realize that the wealthiest man to ever live isn't as well as you might presume.
I am become meme.
The main character of the past decade, Donald Trump, who's lived a lifetime of getting what he wants, is spending his final years gripping onto power. Finally in a position to do just about anything he wants, his party in control of every branch of government, Trump's second term has proven to be anything but the glorious, triumphant phoenix rising from the ashes that he and his supporters wanted. Rather, he sits at the most unpopular in his life. He, his family, and his administration may have been able to rake in several billions of dollars of personal wealth through crypto scams, family businesses, insider trading, and selling of presidential pardons. But at the end of the day, Trump not only demands the praise of the people, a shrinking subset of the population with each passing day, but the glory of being a great man, an appetite which has now entrapped the United States in yet another quagmire in the Middle East, and its erraticism setting the table for the end of the American global hegemon. And this is all to say of material consequence, lest we forget about the highest degree of moral rot that seeps through the upper crust. Do you wish to live entirely without abandon? To live a life of sheer and utter greed and hedonism, so wholly detached from the human condition? Where every day is summer vacation, an existence so devoid of concern and struggle, and so diluted by all fun, all play? A mode of interface in which you seek and achieve the utmost pleasure at any cost, monetary or human. Your life at the peaks of all of humanity which has ever lived. Jeffrey Epstein's legacy has revealed to the world the true depths of depravity the elite scoop in their own pursuit of excitement.
While the Epstein files have only offered us a tiny glimpse into what's under the table of the true high rollers, it's still been plenty enough to blind us with the sheer evil that comes with having it all. A world far more corrupted and wicked than any edgy director producing Extremity could even conjure of. After so long, you have to ask yourself, is it really worth it to live so high? And of course, it's fitting that the man who lived permanently off on Cloud 9, a surreal life of inhuman bliss and insidious reach, would die meek and unceremoniously in a concrete box. To believe Epstein is gone is to believe the appetites which he satisfied have grown quiet. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of apex fixers. From the penthouses of Manhattan to the palaces of Beijing, wherever there's capital, there too is Jeffrey Epstein. You see, the brain is like an engine. The more you feed of it of any given thing, the more it's going to demand of it. When you live a life of opulence, prestige, and access, then eventually the food isn't good enough, the view isn't high enough, the space is not exclusive enough. What is the thrill of buying a new supercar if you already have exotics piling up in the garage, never driven again beyond the initial purchase? What is the excitement in anything when you can experience endlessly? Think of how much more enjoyable a song is when it naturally plays on the radio versus turning it on Spotify. For the few that make it to such heights, whether through birth or having consumed enough dogs, what's next? After so long, the high life isn't enough for those who experience the pinnacle of so. Rather, the demands of your greed only metastasizes, the more depraved to chase your dopamine withers, and the desire to exercise absoluteness and to have everything you will to be it rots away your faculties. After you've been so high, the only excitement comes from going so low. The truth is, the high life is not the good life. The good life is to live well, to have whatever it is that fulfills you at a deeper level, to be loved, to be able to sleep at night with both eyes shut, to understand that being alive is truly glorious, to just be happy. If it hasn't been made clear by now, the high life is an inherently corrosive way of being to the soul. Unless truly antisocial, with every fiber of your being primed for self-interest, it's inevitable the degenerate qualities of high living will begin to wear away at what makes you, a fact of nature, no matter your status or intelligence. The high life and the good life may not be mutually exclusive, but they might as well be. The last of the 5 good emperors of the Roman Empire, Marcus Aurelius, once stated that the happiness of your life is dependent on the quality of your thoughts. At the end of the day, when I look into the eyes of these people, I see nothing. And be aware, it's the ones who still have a sparkle in their eye who are most evil. Sure, the high rollers have fancy cars and high views, but at what cost? Al Capone was a true kingpin, but his own hubris, his past life, and the law ultimately brought about his demise, a common fate that the path walked by many others, adorned in premature death. Celebrities possess the means to live as true heathens, yet a great deal of them live suspended in futile efforts to beat entropy and achieve contentment. Even those with the deepest vaults and authoritative support find themselves deeply immiserated, paranoid and spiteful of even loved ones, potentially out to take what's theirs. And of course, ironically, those who live the highest seem to always end up the lowest. Best case, ending up a hollow, self-loathing husk deprived of glory and respect, and worst case, tortured and killed, a name scorned by mankind. In my humble opinion, the best way to live is to dance along the edge between the high life and the good life. Do good acts, be a decent person, engage with all else of a pro-social nature, but don't forget, you only live once, and depending on your beliefs, there's nothing after. Do take time to luxuriate yourself in the excesses of life, but don't get addicted. Spend too much time living high, and you'll never want to come back down.